Hello, and welcome to another exciting episode of To the Edge, where we'll be discussing Geek, Chic. And since Chris, you brought up the show, and welcome back, by the way, you can start off the topic.
Well, thank you, Roland. I would just like to say thank you for having me back again. Basically, the topic of Geek Chic just sort of came up. You're watching television now, and you see a show like The Big Bang Theory, and it's basically a show about geeks. These guys are doctors and physicists, and but it's just that sort of trend in society where it's that stereotypical nerd, like say from the film Revenge of the Nerds, the guy wearing the pocket protector and the black horned rimmed glasses. Like there's the lines between that have really kind of blurred, and there's just it's sort of become cool to be a geek.
Yeah, I remember before the only comic book movies you really had were Batman and Superman, and now comic book movies, they're everywhere, and that would have been unimaginable a while ago.
Oh, totally. I mean, especially even in the 90s, we had the Batman films, the Michael Keaton.
But that was it.
But yeah, exactly, that was it. And then just all of a sudden, I think it was something that the audience was there for it. And, obviously they made these films. I think it kind of all started with like the X-Men film.
Yeah.
Like that was one of the big ones that got it off the ground. And I think Blade in 1997.
Well, I would credit it more to X-Men in 2000, followed by Spider-Man in 2002.
Yeah, so I mean, those are two examples right there. Just that kind of snowballed from there, and that's why you're getting X-Men First Class and the Wolverine movie, and you're getting Batman Begins and Batman, just
Dark Knight.
the
Green
Dark
Lantern.
Knight. Yes, the Green Lantern. Yeah, there is sort of an underbelly of this. Not every superhero film has been the best, but
Fantastic Four, which I haven't seen, but everyone seems to be trashing.
I actually enjoyed that. I just usually set my bar so low that it couldn't possibly be as bad as, but sometimes they do fail to disappoint.
Yeah, but then there's also a film like Thor, where I never thought that they'd make a film about Thor.
Yeah, those films they really surprised me, actually. Like Thor. I come from a background more of I never read the comics, so my only exposure is either through popular culture or if it was on TV. Like if it was, I'm a TV kid,
Right.
So if they made a cartoon, and Thor was in a cartoon, then I would know Thor. But so I don't know.
Or Transformers. Transformers has exploded.
Yeah, I mean that's like yet another one. I mean they're actually they're going to be making a fourth Transformers film. So it's kind of like that whole genre has just exploded, and I part of me wonders like are they making it mainstream? Like is it mainstream to begin with, or do they like sort of like pander to the audience? Like we're gonna make it big explosion and boom 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 and that type of thing.
I think that they've tried to make it more mainstream so that these geek properties or nerd properties, whatever you want to call them,
Yeah.
they become more acceptable and more profitable.
Well, I mean, like look at Star Trek. I mean, you had sort of if maybe say even 5 years ago or 10 years ago, you'd say, well, describe your prototypical Star Trek fan, and you'd think like the guy and like, oh, Star Trek's cool, man.
Yeah.
But I think with like the Star Trek, I'm saying this in jest, but I think like with the new Star Trek film, with the J.J. Abrams Star Trek, they really tried to kind of. I don't want to say they tried to make it more accessible, so that way.
I'd say that they made it more accessible.
So that way, because the way I kind of feel about comics, like as somebody who never read comics in the 60s or 70s or 80s or 90s, for me, like there's this whole world of comics out there that I don't know where to begin, So I think with Star Trek, they said we're going to reboot it. We're not going to have anything to do with. The next generation or the Deep Space Nine, and it's a new beginning. We're going back to everybody knows Kirk, Kirk and Spock and McCoy, those are the sort of popular culture things. Like everybody and your mom knows who they are.
Yeah. I'm a doctor, not a.
So, just by bringing that out, and they definitely make it more accessible to audience. Because I mean, that's I guess at the end of the day, when you look at the entertainment industry, they're on one hand they're trying to make art, and they're trying to tell a story and entertain you. But on the other hand, they're trying to make money. So you kind of hope that those two sides can kind of work together,
Right.
where they can, you hopefully create a model where, yes, we can tell a good, compelling story and have it be profitable at the same time.
Now, I want to segue out of that for a moment with trilogies. I think that that's a mistake to have everything be a trilogy because it's a dead end. You have part 1, part 2, part 3, and you can't continue beyond that if you end the trilogy definitively. I think that they should move away from trilogies and make these films more open-ended so you can have installments. Like with the Joker film, I was thinking they could do a great Joker Batman movie, but now they ended things so definitively with The Dark Knight Rises that you couldn't.
Yeah, it's well, they did kind of leave a little open-ended there, but
It'd be really forced.
I've been saying that for years, though. If you look at like the Indiana Jones films, basically each one is kind of its own, its own individual, chapter or installment of the series. You can watch Temple of Doom without having seen the, Raiders of the Lost Ark, or you can watch Last Crusade without having seen Temple of Doom. There's really no need to watch the fourth one that they made, but I agree about they try and kind of go back and shoehorn some of these films as trilogies, kind of like what they did the Pirates of the Caribbean films.
Yeah.
It was a great film, like as a one-off. That was one installment, but then they tried to make 2 and 3, and they tried to make it kind of fit into the first one, and I just didn't like the way they did that, and I think they kind of corner themselves as far as storytelling, because we'll make the second movie, but we're really just making one long movie, sort of like the Matrix trilogy, where, again, you had the first film was standalone by itself, a phenomenal film, and the way it just the cinematography and the way of shooting, and it just had an effect on the way other films were made. You'd see all these other Matrix type movies that would come out, but then they had 2 and 3 come out, and it was like, so.
Well, that's the opposite of making it more mainstream, because the first Matrix film was very mainstream, and then they threw it all out with the second and third film.
Yeah, pretty much. They went all out sci-fi, and I think it got too big. I don't know if that's possible, but
I would say so. I watched the trilogy recently, and I'd say so.
yeah. So and definitely, I would be curious to look at the box office results of it's like, okay, you have the Matrix, but then you have 2 and 3, and it's like how did that do commercially versus if they. Obviously there was more story to tell, but they could have possibly done other installments of like, let's look at the crew of another ship, or let's look at the people that live in the city that's at the center of the earth.
You know what I think is a good film series? The Alien film series, because they focus on different characters in every film, and they're spaced out over a period of years, so they're not one after another, and it's not really an escalation. And then with Prometheus, they just went in a totally different direction. They keep it fresh.
Well, I really like Prometheus. The first time I watched it, I wasn't really sure what to think, but it sort of had ties to the, I think a lot of people went into that expecting Alien. Like
Right.
they were expecting the chest burster, and they were expecting xenomorphs, which is the name for for the aliens, and it turned out to be its own. It basically they kind of inserted that in there, but it kind of has its own mythos. But it does give you a little backstory to if you are a fan of the Alien series.
I'm personally glad that they didn't focus on the xenomorphs, because how many times can you possibly have the xenomorph running through the ship and then they have to do something?
That's it. And you have Alien, which is sort of the space horror flick, and then you have the Aliens, the James Cameron film, which was sort of that. That was like, I think that was the big one.
Yeah, it was the Marines.
And again, it was the action flick, the Space Marines. And then you had Alien 3, directed by David Fincher, and that was sort of more, it still had a lot of action in it, but it was a little bit more cerebral, I guess.
It was more like a prison film.
Exactly. And then you had Alien 4, Resurrection, which was sort of the director, Jean-Pierre Jeunet,
Yep.
who we're both familiar with from watching Amelie,
Yeah.
and it was funny when I made that connection that like, okay, he directed Alien 4, he directed Amelie, and essentially that was his interpretation of an American blockbuster film. So when you watch it and everything's just sort of like blown out of proportion.
It's very different. It's like Alien as a foreign film written by Joss Whedon.
Pretty much, and that was written by Josh. You know, you can kind of see different. You know, in a lot of his work, he always has like those same type of characters, so that
Yeah.
comes out. But
But yeah, each installment was different, and I think that with a lot of modern film trilogies, they just keep it the same and there's no variation. All they do is escalate the scale, and that gets kind of exhausting after a while just watching that.
well, they did that like with the Transformers films. Like you know, they had the first Transformers, and that was the the Allspark cube, and so it was Megatron fighting Optimus Prime, which is how it should be, And then the second film they had the Fallen, which was the one where they wanted to was that the one they wanted to bring Cybertron over to Earth, or am I thinking?
That must have been an episode. I really don't remember the plot of Revenge of the Fallen. All I remember is you had skids and mudflap.
Oh boy, but there again, I mean, is that what's happening? You're sort of, trying to, I don't know if you want to use the word pandering to your audience, and you're like, oh well, I think audiences will like this, and they do like the test audiences, like, oh well, audiences didn't like this film, or this didn't test well, or this character, so we're going to cut him down, or
Yeah.
In
In a lot of sequels, what they'll do is they'll exaggerate what people liked about the first film and then discard the rest, and then eventually it kind of morphs into a parody of itself.
Yeah, I mean, even like the scary movie films, which was essentially a parody of, like Scream and a lot of different ones. But by I think fourth or fifth one, I haven't seen them all, but but I mean, I think I want to say that I saw Scary Movie 2 and 3, but just at that point, it was like not even being clever. It was just sort of like, well, what pop culture references can we throw in here?
Well, with certain reboots that have been successful, like Star Trek and Batman Begins and Casino Royale, what they did was they just toned it all the way down, and then they just focused on telling a story instead of thinking, well, how can we outdo ourselves? And that's when the movies do well.
Well, even you talk about reboots. I don't know if you're familiar with Doctor Who.
Somewhat.
And that's that's been one of the I know people, like, it seems like everybody is a Doctor Who fan.
I'm not.
Present
I don't
company
dislike it,
excluded.
but I don't watch it.
But it's just so funny to see people watching that who you would not expect to be watching. I mean, you could argue if you would say, like, is it a science fiction show? I mean, obviously it's about a 700-year-old Time Lord that travels in a blue box that can go, back and forth in space and time.
I think it sits in the nexus between fantasy and sci-fi.
So yeah, because they don't really get caught up on techno jargon and techno babble like a Star Trek, but it just has this wide audience, and I think when they sort of rebooted that, because I mean that's another how I had mentioned that there's so much history, and you're going back to Doctor Who that's been on the air for I want to say 40 years or maybe
More
longer,
than that, like
maybe
50. They began in the early 60s, and I tried to watch from the beginning. And I like a lot of older programs, so I thought maybe I'll like this. I couldn't get into it.
Yeah, so it's you want to make it accessible. So back in 2005, they sort of rebooted it, but they kept true to the history, and with the Doctor, it's sort of built in that the Doctor, if he dies or something happens, he will regenerate and he'll come back as a different person. So that they've done this several times now since 2005, and the latest Doctor, Matt Smith. It just seems him and also David Tennant, it just exploded, and you see people watching Doctor Who, and they'll post about it on Facebook and Tumblr, and
Yeah.
the memes that come out that it's just sort of. But it's kind of cool though, because you see people, it's even like in. When you think about science fiction, that type of stuff, you think of predominantly like that's a male-dominated, I don't know if you want to say fandom, but there's a lot of women that like it too.
Yeah, you've had a lot of these franchises that have been very male-dominated, but you've seen a lot more women get into it, and you've seen a lot more of these franchises try to cater to women, so it's becoming more co-ed, I'd say.
Yeah, and it's that accessibility where people can get into it, and you don't have to have seen the first Doctor. But I mean, I want to say it was like 63, 60, somewhere early 60s.
It was 63.
All the way up through the 80s and 90s. They tried to bring Doctor Who back in the mid 90s. They had a one-off movie, and that was just really abysmal. I mean, I've since gone back and watched some of the older Doctor Who, like the classic, like Tom Baker, and I've enjoyed it. But it's not quite. You can definitely tell if it's of an era. It's kind of like trying to go back and watch classic Star Trek or even Next Generation, compared to what might be out now.
Yeah. So the new Doctor Who, is that actually a reboot, or is it just set later?
It's just set later. It's I mean, it's all in the same universe, so it's not like that they are breaking ties with what happened before. But like with the new Matt Smith series, after David Tennant left the show, there was a new showrunner. And basically they just kind of hit the reboot, So while they still have that history, I mean, he's still the Doctor, but it was sort of like, if you have never seen a new Doctor Who episode before, you can start watching now and you can get into it.
So it's a jumping on point.
Oh, definitely. So, and I think that's what helped bring in a lot of new audience, because so many people are, I think that's what happens. Like, people will post about it, the social networking, they'll post about it on Twitter and on Tumblr and on Facebook, and people will see that and like, well, I want to watch it now, and then they get into it themselves, and it's sort of it kind of snowballs.
Who was really taken off, and it surprised me? George Takei.
Yeah, he's definitely got his own his following.
I saw Star Trek 4 in the theater not too long ago. They were showing it in Coolidge, and a bunch of people clapped when George Takei's name came up in the credits.
Takei.
Yeah, San Francisco. I was born there.
Yeah, it's kind of cool how he's definitely taken his status, I guess, as because he was never one of the leading men of the film, but I mean, he's got his own little following now, and he's got his Facebook page, and he has like all these fans, and I mean, it got to be the point where everybody was sharing stuff that he would post. I didn't even need to be friends with him on Facebook. So.
Me either. I see all this stuff all the time, and I don't like him. I mean, like him on Facebook. I don't have a problem with George Takei personally.
Mm-hmm. No, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's okay to be Takei.
But what else can you think of where geek culture has become more acceptable? The computer is obviously one thing.
Well, I mean, it's kind of funny. I mean, I guess technology was something that that was typically seen as like the nerds, but everybody has a cell phone now. I mean, everybody's using computers. Computers have become such a huge part of society. It's like how can you think about getting up and not checking your email, or people walking around with their cell phones and smartphones, and it used to be something that that you take computer class and that type of thing.
Yeah, I learned how to type in computer class.
And it was sort of like well, who uses computers? Only nerds use them. But and even video gaming too. I mean, video gaming has just it crossed this threshold where it was once a Pong or Pac-Man or something, but now you get it just has such a broad appeal. I mean, you have so something like the Nintendo, where they were able to sort of market them, and that's what it is. That's a lot of it is marketing. They were able to create this demand for like the Wii Fit, or they had a lot of the different interactivity with the Wii, or even the Xbox Live, like games like Call of Duty, or where people can you just pick it up and you can start playing.
With video games, they must have entered into the mainstream fairly early on, because I don't remember video games ever being considered a geek thing, at least from Nintendo on in general. But I do note that video games have gained a lot more acceptance in the adult community than before.
Well, yeah, definitely. I mean, it's not just looked at as a kid thing, whereas you used to think like video games are for kids. But I mean, there's I mean, basically what happened was, well, kids who grew up in the 70s and 80s that were playing video games, now they're in their, their 30s and 40s, and they want, they have disposable income, and they want to, so they're making these video games for adults, the Grand Theft Autos and the Call of Duties and the Halos. So it's
Well, hopefully responsible adults don't take any cues from Grand Theft Auto.
well,
Yeah.
so but yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't think video games were ever like it was like never like a negative thing, but I think it's just like sort of that stereotypical like
It's computers.
yeah, exactly, and just seemingly for a while, I mean, computers were, it was just sort of seen as this sort of like, well, only certain people will use computers, but now, and even across the genders, I mean, whereas that was another thing where it was like, well, only guys will use computers, or but obviously people of both sexes both use computers now, and so I think that's been sort of a big equalizer.
I remember back in 1997 when I was in high school, the teacher asked, well, how many of you are online? And half the students raised their hand, and frankly, I was surprised that even half used the internet. I thought only people like me used the internet.
Yeah, and I mean, just look at how far it's come now. I mean, I was just thinking about, the phrase like, "Oh, I'm online." Like, I mean, but the way it is now with smartphones, and you're always online,
Right.
because But I remember like sitting at the computer, and you had your instant message, and a lot of times, I still have that in my head of, I'm sitting down at my desk to use my computer, but now with, laptops and notebooks and iPads and tablets, people could be anywhere. They could be sitting at Starbucks, or they could be sitting in their living room, or, they could be in their kitchen eating cereal, and they're on, they're doing stuff on computers.
Yeah, that amazed me when I go into places like Panera and other restaurants now where they have instant Wi-Fi. I was like, wow, I'm amazed.
Yeah, I mean, for those of us who used to have to dial up with the 14.8 megabyte or kilobyte per second
Something.
modem.
I remember the good old days when you download an image and it would go down like this, one step at a time.
Yeah.
Or a document wouldn't be displayed because it was too long.
Yeah, exactly.
Too much text.
Yeah, exactly. It's it's funny how things have come now. So.
That was only 15 years ago that I'm talking about.
Oh yeah, definitely. It's I mean, I think that the online world is just growing exponentially. So it's just the way things have changed. And I think in most ways for the better. I mean, as with anything, with great power comes great responsibility.
Right.
And it seems like with new technology, there's new ways to abuse it. But I think overall the advances are we're for the better.
And with those advances, you have advances in CGI, and I think that's what made the comic book movie more possible, because 20 years ago, you could only do an animated version of most comic book movies. Now the technology exists that they can actually be live action.
Oh yeah, and just the believability and stuff that we'll take Avatar. I mean that was James Cameron's Avatar. That was a film that probably most definitely couldn't have been made 10 or 15 years ago even. Just the advances and it seems like every movie, or every few years there will come a movie that will just kind of advance cinema, or that they'll do something new, and it just kind of takes us another leap and bound forward. And I think with that improved technology for computer generated imagery, and people are able to get more creative, and
And not just forward, sideways as well, because I noticed that Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter, they open the gateways for fantasy as well.
Oh yeah, I mean, even Harry Potter, like you say, it's that's another whole genre on its own, that just people reading Harry Potter, and it's opened up. It's sort of I guess you could say it's like a gateway drug.
Yeah.
You start reading Harry Potter, and then you get into this and that.
And then you've got Narnia.
Yeah. So just all these different properties that have made it like, even being like a Tolkien fan, like, it's sort of been like, like, hey, did you watch Lord of the Rings? Like, but I mean, people will openly, like, yes, I'm a big fan of that, or or the Game of Thrones, like George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones, like that's that TV show itself has become huge. Or the zombie genre. Look at The Walking Dead, like that itself has that's become widely accessible. And and again, you have people, you have both genders, watching this show.
Yeah, that surprised me.
And
to be honest.
So it's not just a guy thing. It's people. So it just has that broad appeal. So I think it's maybe a little bit of both, where you have something it's accessible for everybody, but then you also have sort of the great equalizer, I guess, of people that have broken down sort of stereotypes and social mores that have kind of paved the way. So it's like, yeah, I can be geek and I can be proud of it, and I don't care what you're gonna think about it.
There's another thing too. I remember that 10 years ago, everything was very escapist and shallow content. Nowadays, it seems that most films and some TV shows, they're becoming more psychological. So there's a reason to become invested in these characters and become involved in the story.
Oh, definitely. It's the, especially when with, I mean, to me, it's always been about, if I watch a television program, you're investing your time in them, like something like Battlestar Galactica, the re-envisioned Ron Moore series. And, you're using up about 80 hours of your life to watch this show from beginning to end. And even Edward James Olmos, like he had that, basically that was his quote, where he says, if you watch this from beginning to end, you're using up about 80 hours of your life, and I want to make sure this is something that is worth getting invested in. And it's not necessarily the fact that they're in outer space or that they're fighting killer robots. Like it's the people, it's the interactions.
I think that show is a prime example of mainstreaming something that used to be thought of as geeky. I don't know if you've actually seen the 70s Battlestar Galactica.
I'm very familiar with that.
Yeah. So that show is a show that could not have been more of a complete 180-degree turn from the original to the reboot.
And again, that's another example of people that I and I don't know. Sometimes I wonder, like, well, maybe it's just the circles that I travel in, because I mean, I know a lot of people who are open-minded. I'm not saying that to be like, the people, the company that I keep, but just the people that I know that might be more willing to be accepted, to be open-minded to that type of stuff, I guess. I mean, but I mean, I know like teenagers and 21-year-olds that are watching Battlestar Galactica, and it's like, what, because you'd think, well, that show hasn't been on the air for for several years now,
right.
And how could they get into that? But I think it's goes to show it's just well written. The show itself, and I think that's a probably one of the best examples, because they certainly didn't pander to audiences. They didn't dumb that show down.
Definitely not.
That was a show where every script was just really sharp in the dialogue and the story, and to see people who have never seen it before, and it's like, you have to watch this show. And they watch it and they're like, oh my God.
You always wanted to know what happened next. Every cliffhanger would have you on edge.
There's a series called Portlandia, and it's sort of it's like a comedy, like sort of a sketch series. And but there's one of their sketches where they sit down. It has Fred Armisen, and the name of the girl is slipping my mind, but they sit down one weekend to watch Battlestar Galactica, and they're watching it, and that's the whole joke, is that they're sitting in there, they're getting the DVDs and they're putting them in one after the other, and like they're calling in sick from work on Monday and Tuesday, because it's like, we have to finish this. So,
well, Battlestar Galactica, that's kind of like the Sopranos of sci-fi TV.
Definitely, it made its mark, and I think it's going to be a show that hopefully people will be watching it 20 years from now or 50 years from now, and it's not like, it's funny to watch old sci-fi because it's very dated, and especially with the effects, and maybe these effects will become dated as well. I mean, even today that you watch like maybe one of the first episodes, and maybe they didn't have the best budget back then.
But with Battlestar Galactica, they grounded everything so much in reality. Even my uncle once said there's nothing fake about it, that I think that it will age well from a production standpoint, because it was all practical.
Oh, definitely. And I think that's why you see some of these films where they do rely on computer generated, and it's just, it shows its age. I mean, not to say that it makes it any less of a movie or a TV show, but like Babylon 5.
Oh God, I can't watch that because of the CGI.
It's wretched. It's that really bad, like mid '90s, early '90s type of CG. I mean, if you get past it, if you can overlook that, I mean, it's just sort of like that's the medium that they had at the time.
Right.
But that versus practical, I mean, I like with the Star Wars trilogy, like the original trilogy, I prefer the unadulterated, unedited, unretouched versions over the new George Lucas, CG, all that stuff.
Or in the Star Trek shows, they delayed introducing CGI as long as possible. Even late into Deep Space Nine and Voyager, they still used model work.
Yeah. I think there's much more, I mean, not to take away from the people who work in computer-generated imagery, because that's an art form all on itself, but I mean, I just, myself, it's a preference thing, I guess. Some people like Coke, some people like Pepsi. I mean, and of course, maybe in making a film, maybe doing everything practically is more expensive and might limit certain things, but I think if you can do practical makeup, if you can do practical effects, it's gonna make that more, if you're able to blend the two, I think that's the best thing is,
right.
Getting, so it's basically, you look at you're an artist and you have tools that are available to you, or it's part, it's something on your palette that you can, I can use that here, I can use this here.
Right, because if it looks like, if it's bad CGI, everyone's going to be able to tell. They'll be like, this looks like a cartoon.
Yeah, exactly.
And you don't want that.
No.
Takes you right out of the film or the show.
Well, that's it. I mean, you're able to suspend your disbelief, and that's what it is with a lot of things with me. You can say, I can believe that these guys are in the future. I can believe that these guys are, riding around in a spaceship. But then something will happen, something will come along and be like, no, I can't get behind that.
All right, well, I think that it's just about time to wrap this up. Is there anything else you'd like to add about the spread of geek culture?
I don't think so. I think we've kind of gone over quite a few topics here. I mean, it's really interesting, to see how far things have come along, and you watch shows like The Big Bang Theory, and just from my own personal experience, and seeing people, and it's exciting, because this is something, and it's not even necessarily about being a geek anymore. I think it's just mainstream, where stuff, it's so you're not being labeled one thing or another.
Right.
I mean, I detest labels. I mean, why do I have to be pigeonholed into one little corner here? So I mean, I can like this and I can like that, or I can sit down and watch a football game, and I can sit down and watch a show about zombies.
Right.
So
I mean, the labels, it's just shorthand to not bother to discover other things or to bother to get to know people better.
yeah, exactly. So
All right, well, that's all the time that we have for this week for To the Edge. See you next time, and thanks for being on the show again,
well,
Chris.
thank you for having me.